So, friends, the verdict is in. After Donald Trump's horrific speech to the nation's top military commanders, suggesting that they should use American cities and the American people as military training grounds for fighting wars, every military leader now knows that Donald Trump is not only a dangerously unfit commander-in-chief, but he is a domestic enemy of the Constitution. I just sat down with military law expert, law professor, and retired Army JAG, Dan Maurer. Dan is a true subject matter expert on these issues, and I would urge you to look him up on Substack. You can find him at Dan Maurer, DanMaurer, and the number 1. I'll also put a link to his Substack page in the description of this video. He is providing really valuable information that will sort of help you assess what in the world Donald Trump is doing to the United States military at this dangerous moment in our nation's history. So I hope you enjoy this conversation with law professor and military law expert Dan Maurer. I'm really pleased to have military law expert and law professor Dan Maurer with us to talk about a really remarkable address to the troops by Pete Hegseth and President Trump. I'm really excited to hear Dan's take on it. Dan is a retired Army JAG, retiring as a lieutenant colonel. He has taught at West Point, constitutional law and criminal law. He's taught at the Army's Judge Advocate General School, where I attended the 115th basic course. It's located on the campus of the University of Virginia in Charlottesville. It is where lawyers go before they begin practicing military law as Army JAGs. Dan taught there. He currently teaches at Ohio Northern University's Claude W. Pettit College of Law. And Dan, thank you for jumping on with our friends here on Substack.
No, thank you for having me, and I look forward to the conversation.
And I will tell you, for anybody who's interested in a deep dive regarding Dan's expertise, we did a 3-part series that's up on my YouTube channel where we talked about the military members being deployed to the streets of America. We talked about the duty of all military members to both obey lawful orders, but to disobey patently unlawful orders. And we talked about this recent phenomenon where it looks like military leadership is scouring social media posts of military members and probably misusing them to retaliate or have an excuse to retaliate against military members that they don't like for some reason. So that's a really deep dive 3-part interview series up on YouTube. But Dan, today, I just want to throw it open to you and ask your thoughts about what you saw with Secretary of Defense, which is what I will always call that position, Pete Hegseth, and President Donald Trump addressing our nation's top military leadership. And people say generals and admirals, yes, but also sergeants major, the top enlisted ranks of our military. And I think Dan and I might be in agreement on this. NCOs, sergeants, make it all work. And I assume they had the leadership of the Warrant Officer Corps as well at this meeting. But Dan, let me just throw it open to you and tell me what your thoughts were about what you saw.
Okay. Well, thanks again. So I tuned in, and for the first couple minutes, I sat there thinking, "Wow, this is hyped up, motivational. This is a leader who understands standards and wants to motivate people." And then I stopped myself and I realized or remembered that this is the Secretary of Defense talking to 800 plus 4 stars, 3 stars, 2 stars, 1 stars, and their senior enlisted advisors. This was not a brand new captain taking command of a company speaking to 100 plus junior soldiers, trying to instill discipline and a sense of camaraderie and cohesion, and reinforce messages about fitness and good order. That's what captains do, lieutenants, first sergeants do at a very, very, very low tactical level. That's like the basic stuff. And here you have the Secretary of Defense, the second most powerful person on the planet when you consider the military control he has underneath the president, the second most powerful man on the planet, with that audience, given that message, was embarrassing. It was unnecessary. None of them knew, at least from reporting, none of them knew why they were going there in the first place. They didn't know what to expect, just like we didn't know what to expect. It could have been any number of things, and frankly, I'm glad it wasn't a number of other things, because it could have been really bad. It could have been a purge. It's like, hey, you're fired, you're fired, you're fired because you shouldn't be in the position you're in because of quote DEI, or because you're too woke, or whatever. But you're going to be in, you're going to be in, you're going to be in. Or let's do a loyalty oath to the president of the United States who's standing right off stage, right? Those would have been horrendous. And I suspect if that had happened, it not only was the event unprecedented, but you would have had another unprecedented event in which you'd had mass resignations, because that would have been the dutiful thing to do if that had happened. So thankfully it had not happened, but it was a waste of time. What it was a waste of time. And for him to almost speak down to these senior leaders manifests not just disrespect, but just misunderstanding, just a lack of experience and understanding what his role is. Yes, he is a civilian authority with managerial control, leadership over the department. No one doubts that. No one doubts that. And will follow lawful orders from the chain of command, to include the Secretary of Defense. But you don't display leadership at that level by speaking like you're a 22-year-old lieutenant or a 27-year-old captain. You have to remember that his experience in the military is limited. Now, that's not all that unusual for secretaries of defense, actually. Most secretaries of defense either didn't serve or served very little time. Secretary Gates, for example, well-respected Secretary of Defense, 2 terms, a Republican and a Democrat he served, president of a university, director of the CIA, but he only spent 4 years or so in the Air Force as a young officer. So military experience per se is not necessary. But when you take into account what his experiences were, it's not all that surprising what he did and how he said it. Right? He tapped out as a major in the National Guard, and not disrespecting the National Guard or tapping out as a major, but there's a reason why he left as a major. He was essentially forced out. He had some views on things that were not consistent with good order and discipline, in my opinion. He has some views. We'll put it that way. You can read his book if you're really interested in his views, or you can just Google transcripts of what he said during his confirmation hearing. He has very negative views on women in combat. He has very negative views on what he would call affirmative action, DEI. He has very negative views on anything that looks like rule of law, rules of engagement. He disparaged rules of engagement yet again. He disparaged JAGs during his confirmation hearing. He does it in his book, calls them jag-offs. This is not a mature person. This is not a wise person. This is not a person that you would entrust the degree of authority and responsibility that he has to a person like this. He tapped out with tactical level experience in Afghanistan, Iraq, and at Gitmo. His only exposure to higher level strategic thinking and planning is in the current office that he sits. That's it. Never led major organizations, never had expansive national security experience at a strategic level, like working as a civilian in the White House or even in DOD. He doesn't have that. And so it's not surprising that what he thinks of as military good order and discipline or morale building is limited to what you'd see at a platoon or a company level.
And I would agree with you that it's not surprising. It was appalling. It was demeaning and belittling. It was like he was talking to a group of, junior ROTC cadets about, don't be fat, right? Fat generals, I think he used the term, and talking about haircuts and shaving. And so it's not surprising, but, how do you think that landed with our nation's military leadership?
Well, I suspect most of them weren't terribly surprised. What I'm happy to see is the images, the photos of the just the blank faces. That's exactly what should have been, regardless of what civilian and what administration is speaking. When you are talking to that audience, you should see blank expressions. You should see neutrality, right? You should not know whether that general or admiral supports that administration or does not support that administration. They do it as a professional matter. They have to support it by law. But whether they agree with it or not is immaterial, right? They follow lawful orders, whether it's a Democrat or a Republican in office, and whether they agree with that person personally or not. So it's right to see them stoic, stone faced, and silent. That was good. I think internally, uh, just again, speaking from experience, and if I had been in the audience, I'm not sure I would have been able to maintain that level of decorum. I think I might have made a face. I might have, mm, I might have done something that would have got attention. But I'm glad that they were there, and their 30 plus years of service that got them to the position that they're in gives them plenty of experience in being in rooms where they have to listen to things that they don't agree with, where they might violently disagree with it, but they have to follow it. And so it was a good thing to see the objective neutrality responses. So if there's one positive takeaway from the disaster, the dumpster fire that was that speech, it's that I have more confidence that the senior military leadership is not partisan, at least not overtly partisan. So I want to contrast that with what we saw back in June at Fort Bragg,
Mm.
where the president spoke in front of thousands of troops, and he had troops behind him who were evidently screened for, let's say, ideological consistency. Like if you did not like Trump, you were supposed to tell the chain of command so that they wouldn't put you back behind Trump, so that you wouldn't see scowling or shaking your head or making faces. Instead, what you ended up with was people who supported Trump. We're not supposed to know that, whether they're privates or sergeants or lieutenants or captains or colonels. We're not supposed to care or know what an individual soldier, airman, sailor, or marine thinks about politics. They can have an opinion, but we shouldn't see it ever. Because if we do, that calls into question the nonpartisan culture and norm that we should be expecting our military to follow. And what we saw in June was the exact opposite. That gave me and many others lots of reasons to be concerned. Because not only was the president willing to do that, but we had troops willing to do that. And that's a shame. So hopefully what this does, and I'm quite certain that what happened will be fodder for many what would be called officer professional development sessions throughout chains of command across the world. This is what you're supposed to do. If you don't agree, fine. If you agree, fine. But you will be silent, you will be respectful, and you will be neutral. Because that is what our public demands of our military.
And
So
Dan, that's the signal that you would send in the military, that I would send in the military. In the military, we would not only comport ourselves that way, but we would insist that anybody else who might be under our command also behave that way. But it is so destructive and demeaning and disrespectful when, as you say, at I think the Fort Bragg uh, show, you had military leadership that it was apparently willing to go against what we all know is our culture, our tradition, and the expectation that we will be apolitical. So it's great that people like you and I would insist on holding the line and doing things properly. But look at where Trump has taken at least some of the military leadership who are willing to buy in to using the military as political props if it suits Donald Trump's purposes.
Yeah, and while I just said that I think I'm feeling better about it, and feeling better about the nonpartisan ethic, there's still reason to be concerned, frankly. And I look at the boat strikes in September, the three different boat strikes in the Caribbean, in international waters, on these alleged narco terrorists, without any legal authority to do it, either under domestic law or international law. And we can spend an hour talking about what that all means, but I think the vast majority of commentators are pretty well agreed that there is no lawful authority for the president to have dictated those strikes, which means the chain of command that followed that order and planned and executed those strikes were executing unlawful orders. And they should have known that. And they should have pushed back. Maybe they did push back and then were threatened in some way. No, this is a lawful order. You will follow it or else. I don't know. But my suspicion is that it was all three of them were probably president, SecDef, and then much of the chain of command below it was cut out to include their lawyers. So probably, if this had been like a signature strike, or a significant Al Qaeda target, let's say Osama bin Laden, right? It would have been president, SecDef, a few key advisors at that level, the combatant command level, 4-star, and then an operational commander who is then probably talking directly to a drone operator. I suspect something very similar happened here. So Special Operations Command, Joint Special Operations Command, and then the drone, with the drone operator and the direct commander of that drone operator. Very few other people, I suspect, were actually involved in that decision-making, planning process, and execution. So that's telling, right? If that in fact happened, that signals that the chain of command, the top level chain of command, president, probably, or secretary, probably thought there might be pushback. There might be resistance. There might be objections, dissent, throughout the chain of command. Because I sure as hell would have. And if I had been an operational lawyer at Southcom, which has operational authority over that area, I would have raised my hand and said, or I hope I would have raised my hand and said, under what legal authority can you claim you can do that? And if I got a crappy answer, I would have pushed higher. And at some point, you have to just say, you call it like it is. This is illegal. And ultimately, the person responsible, excuse me, the person responsible for those strikes aren't the lawyers. It's the commanders. Under our norms, our doctrine of command responsibility, and under international law, commanders are the ones morally and legally accountable for those kinds of strikes. So there was a breakdown at some level. There was a decision that we're going to go forward. And whether that was because the chain of command was partisan in a sense, or they really, really wanted to please the president or not displease the president, I don't know. It's just it was a sad day 3 times last month to hear about these strikes.
Yeah. So let's move from Pete Hegseth's address to the military leadership to what Donald Trump said. What were your main takeaways and main concerns about what he said? And then we'll talk about how it might impact the thinking of our military leadership moving forward.
Yeah. So I kind of keyed on 2 things. One was the kind of hey, why aren't you kind of applauding for me entrance? You can clap if you want, or if you disagree, you can leave. But if you leave, you're going to lose your rank. None of that needs to be said. None of that is appropriate to display. You don't encourage people to clap. That's just kind of pathetic, frankly. But you're the commander in chief. They're going to listen to you because you outrank them. You are the commander in chief. They work for you. They know that. You don't need to be a bombast. You don't need to display this kind of rank immaturity and just kind of political, how you behave at a rally. This is not a rally, right? Whether it's for esprit de corps, as he put it, it's still not a rally. And yet he treated it like a rally. He bashes Biden, he bashes woke, whatever. He basically complained about the previous administration. And that is a partisan thing to do. That is a political commentary that is entirely inappropriate for that audience, which were following lawful orders under that previous administration. So just by talking about it at all was inappropriate. It was a breach of civil norms. You don't do that. That was one concern. Second concern would have been the insane commentary on let's use American cities as training grounds for our National Guard or active duty. That is just absurd. It's absurd. And I'm quite certain that caused quite a few hearts to palpitate more in that audience, because many of them would have been called to be in charge of such operations. So it's like the president thinks that the military really is an enclave of guardians, separate and apart, living on a hilltop away from the society that they protect, that they're not part of our culture and our society. All of those individuals have families who live in American cities and communities who may vote Democrat. Many of those leaders may vote Democrat or not vote at all. But their family, their friends, their loved ones are all American citizens who live in these communities, who are affected or would be affected by troops on the street, guarding polling places, or enforcing ICE or protecting ICE raids, right? These leaders are part of our society. They're part of our culture. They're part of our communities in the same way that any other civilian is, right? They may live on a base, but they shop off base, right? They visit family off base. They, it continues to baffle me. It continues to boggle my mind how unbelievably unserious and naive and stuck in this weird like 1950s movie vision of what leadership is and what the commander-in-chief's role is respective to the military. It's incredibly shocking still. After all these years, still shocking. And I would think, I certainly would hope, that the leaders in that audience heard that and said to themselves, that would be an illegal order. I'm not doing that. I will not do that. I swore an oath to support and defend the Constitution, not to express loyalty to a particular policy or a particular political party or a particular person. We all know that. So I hope that a statement as broadly insane as that statement was woke up, no pun intended, woke up any leader in that audience who might have been on the fence about whether or not this commander-in-chief has the nation's best interests in mind when it comes to deploying the military. I don't think he does. And I think many in that audience don't think he does. So I think maybe it's a wake-up call.
I hope you're right. And that's how I hope it landed with the military leadership. If they had any lingering doubts about, whether Donald Trump is a fit commander in chief or not, I think Donald Trump laid that to rest. And I cued in on the exact same phrase, which is use American cities as military training grounds. Why does the military train? It is to fight and win wars. So we're going to send military members into the streets of America to train to fight and win wars. And we're going to do it against the American people because in Donald Trump's estimation, at least some segment of the American population is the enemy. He also referred to Americans as the enemy from within. Yeah. He said, these civil disturbances, well, one man's civil disturbance is another man's First Amendment free speech rights being exercised robustly in our streets. It's our right to petition our government, assemble and petition our government for a redress of grievances. And, Donald Trump, it's no secret what he's doing. He's sending ICE agents, masks. He's sending troops, whether they're federalized national, state national guardsmen or, U.S. military members into the streets. It is creating upset and sometimes chaos and dissension. And it is inspiring even more protest, what Trump would call civil disturbances, which must be put down because those are the enemies from within. I can only hope the way those phrases landed with the military leadership of the nation is it reinforced in them their loyalty to the Constitution and not to the president. And you started our chat with, it would have been terrible if this was a gathering designed to have the military members abandon their oath of loyalty to the Constitution and pledge loyalty to the president. But, Dan, I feel like in substance, that is perhaps what Hegseth and Trump intended, but they didn't accomplish it. In fact, I think whatever they intended probably backfired. And I think the military leadership now must have a clear-eyed appreciation of what they're dealing with. So let me ask you this. Um, and let me just comment because you opened the discussion about Trump's address with the fact that he made a joke both about clapping and about, oh, you don't like what I'm saying, you can get up and walk out, but you'll lose your rank and your job. In substance, is what he said. That wasn't a joke. I mean, he'll try to mask it as a joke, but that was an attempt to say, disagree with me and there's hell to pay. So you better abide by my orders, commands, directives, whether lawful or unlawful. But so now here's my concern. We have, and we talked about this previously, about how when you're deploying military members to the streets, they are inevitably involved in civilian law enforcement, even if you try to restrict what they're doing to, supporting and protecting ICE officers and federal property. We now have a federal judge in California on the merits, Judge Charles Breyer, ruling that Donald Trump violated the federal law by deploying military members to the streets of Los Angeles. And yet, here he is doing it again in Portland and perhaps preparing to do it in Chicago. Now it seems like military members would be on even firmer footing to say, these have now been judicially ruled as unconstitutional, illegal acts. But do you have any expectation? I think I know what your answer is, and I'm hoping for a different one. Do you have any expectation that the military leadership will say, now that you've expressly said you want us to war train against the American people in American cities, we're not going to deploy? Any hope of that?
Um, I don't have as much hope as I think you want me to have
Yeah.
or which I wish I had. See, the problem is it's not that deploying the guard or even the active duty is necessarily outside of his authority. He can find a way to deploy troops on the ground for certain things. What's the posse comitatus violations that Judge Breyer talked about were those individual tactical missions that they were assigned within this broad scope of being in LA. And go detain this person for this period of time, go do this checkpoint, form this perimeter. Those things violated the Posse Comitatus Act. Those things are not being led by generals. Those things are being led by sergeants and lieutenants. And those sergeants and lieutenants probably aren't paying attention to federal court orders. They don't have a JAG with them. The only people who have JAGs with them, at least for now, would have been the senior brigade level or colonels or general officers at the headquarters element who are hopefully advising and counseling the planners that when they draft their operations orders and plans, that they are consistent with federal law, that they're not violating the Posse Comitatus Act. So the check, the hope is that the lawyers at that operational level are the blockers, right? That they're the ones stopping the illegality from flowing down if it was going to flow down. But here's why my concern is perhaps elevated. It's because we know how Hegseth feels about JAGs, and there is apparently I've heard this from several people, is that there is probably going to be an attempt to not only move JAGs to temporary immigration role judges or immigration judges, but also cut the ranks entirely, like authorize fewer JAGs. There's nothing stopping that. There's nothing saying that the Secretary of Defense can't tell a unit, you will not have an operational law advisor on that mission. He could do that. He could just strip the JAGs away entirely and make it as if we're, in 1862. Or 1917 when we had JAGs, but they were all in DC or at headquarters in Paris. They were not with the tactical level units. A great advantage that we have as a military is that we do have legal advisors at the tactical level that help ensure that execution of plans and the planning itself is consistent with the rule of law, with international law, with our own domestic law, so that we have legitimacy when we fight. Without legitimacy, we are no better than many of the enemies that we fight. And legitimacy, the military defines it. It's in doctrine. It is defined in part by following the rule of law. So by stripping the ability to follow the rule of law consistently, you're just delegitimizing what we do, both from the public's perception abroad and service members' families and their communities here in the States. So it's deeply concerning.
And rules of engagement keep everyone safe, including our military members. And yet, I think Hegseth called them stupid rules of engagement. And, I can't help but think about a variation on the old saying, first thing we do, let's kill all the military lawyers. And then lawlessness can reign supreme in the military. And that is a recipe for disaster. And it's a recipe to endanger our troops, not keep them safe,
Yeah.
So
not every law of war is intuitive, right? Sometimes they're pretty complex and nuanced. It's not always fair to assume that the soldier on the ground with the weapon knows that some things are just not permitted. But the lawyer will, or should, and the rules of engagement are there to help ensure that those soldiers are acting consistently with the law of war. It's not, I don't want to say it's dumbed down, it's simplified to the point where as long as those soldiers are following the 10 or 12 rules of engagement on the little card that they get distributed that they can put in their pocket, that as long as they're acting consistent with that, it's pretty guaranteed that they're not going to violate any laws. That's a helpful thing for them to be confident, to know that what you're doing is not just, good for the mission and makes you feel good inside, but it's also compliant with the law. No one wants to be lawless. At least most people don't want to be lawless. And my fear is that these soldiers are going to be placed in positions in our streets where they think they're acting in good faith. They think they're following the law. They think they're doing the right thing, not knowing that they are in fact violating the law because they don't have anyone there to help them understand it.
Hmm. So, Dan, let me kind of finish up with this. I can't tell you how much I appreciate, and I know the audience appreciates your, thoughtful, expert, sober analysis, and that's not a joke about Pete Hegseth. It's invaluable in these times. I was only active duty as an Army JAG 6.5 years, and I feel like I know this much, but I really appreciate the expertise and the career that you had as an Army JAG and as you now have as a law professor, because you're able to really bring into focus kind of what's going on. And, these are issues that I think we have to stay on top of, because you do see the abuses of our military being perpetrated and ratcheted up by our civilian leadership. And, I think we have to keep this in the public view. And, I always say pressure bursts pipes. We have to keep the pressure on publicly in every way we can. And these discussions, I think, is one way to do that. So where can people find you if they want to follow your work and your analysis? I know you're on several places, Just Security, maybe Lawfare, LinkedIn, and here on Substack. But where can people find you?
Yeah, so I don't post as much on Blue Sky or X. I try to stay away from that because I Blue Sky is, I think, better than X, and it screens out a lot of the noise. But most of the stuff I comment on, you can find on LinkedIn, uh, um, or Substack. So I try to post a few times a week on Substack. There's a paid version and a free version. Um, I do post a lot on Just Security and Lawfare, which, for those of you who don't know, are essentially curated online blogs, but they're peer reviewed. They're run by experienced practitioners in the national security space, lawyers, professors, retired folks who know quite a bit about national security law, both domestic and international. And they're wonderful essays that are posted every single day on both these sites. So whether you're reading me or anyone else, it's a great way to stay informed. And much of the audience for those venues are not lawyers. They're policymakers, they're thoughtful citizens, they're the public. So it's not lawyers writing for lawyers. It's lawyers writing for public education. And that's what I'm really glad for this opportunity, Glenn. I think the getting out of my classroom and being able to speak to a larger audience is just helpful. The more the public understands about the military, I think is just better for the health of the republic. And the more that we can communicate what the bounds are and what the laws are and what the regulations are and how force is supposed to look and how it's supposed to be constrained, it is just a good thing we do for our communities.
Yeah, so I would urge everybody, please follow Dan and his work. Subscribe to him on Substack because having this information available is invaluable given where we are. We are a struggling democracy right now. And so we all have to be in this fight. So thank you for jumping on today, Dan. I hope we can do this regularly, as I fear we're going to have more abuses of the military coming, and we'll have to contend with them.
Thanks again, Glenn. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Dan. Thank you, everybody.